Perspective, perspective, perspective. Now, if you're an urban sketcher or sketcher looking to improve your skills, then 3-point perspective and vertical perspective are two techniques you'll definitely want to understand. Not only do they help create enticing, captivating and 3D images, they're also really interesting challenges to apply ourselves to as aspiring sketchers. In this class, I really want to give you my framework for understanding these concepts and how I think about them and apply them to my art, and give you all the tools you need to go out and immediately start feeling happy in this world of perspective, particularly with these interesting vertical perspectives. My name is Toby and I'm known as Toby Urban Sketch on Instagram, YouTube and of course here on Skillshare. My style of art is loose, it's splashy, it's got wobbly lines, but I enjoy myself, and it's based in a grounding of theory. By having that little grounding of theory and knowing just enough, I can manipulate things and I can ignore the theory and I can do things which are a bit experimental, but that still work because I understand why I'm doing them. In this class, I want to show you how I do that. So we'll start by looking at the basic theory of perspective. We'll then apply that to 3-point perspective and analyze some photos to work out where the perspective is coming from and where the different vanishing points are. And of course, we then have our final project. Now we'll do this through 4 different stages. Firstly, looking at a pencil sketch to get those structural lines in. Again, working out how we find and simplify perspective down to just 3 points. We'll add some ink on, finding the bits which interest us, working out a little bit more about our composition before splashing on the colours. Now, colours doesn't mean we stop thinking about perspective, and I'll talk to you about exactly what I mean. How on earth can we use colours to enhance perspective? And finally, we finish off with a few splashes and a nice little bit of bold pen work. I'd love you to get involved, to share your project, to ask any questions you have, and I'll make sure to come back and answer them. Please do also find me on Skillshare, follow me and join in with other classes if you like the look of them, or find me outside on Instagram, YouTube or on my website. Most of all though, let's have a little bit of fun with this class, 3-point perspective sketching, and let's see what we can do with it. So hello everyone, now it is time to have a little think about the supplies. And don't worry, there's nothing too clever, nothing too fancy, and be flexible. You don't need to go out and buy a load of things just to do this class. What I happen to be using today is a mechanical pencil and a couple of fine liners. Now the fine liners are waterproof, that's quite important because I'll be adding watercolours after. And I've got them in a thin size, 0.05, and a quite thick size, 0.5mm. It's quite fun to have a couple of sizes because it gives you a bit more variation in your line quality. The paper I'm using is a simple pad of A4 paper, which is cold pressed, 300 grams per square metre watercolour paper. As you can see, it's by Delarani, and it's just student grade. And for sketching and making lovely little fun experimental things, student grade paper is plenty good enough. My watercolours are here now. These are the same watercolours I always use for almost everything. There's 14 colours in here, but we're not using 14 colours. The ones we will use are a bit of cobalt blue, a bit of a Mayan orange, which is a sort of nice red colour, some Hansa yellow, a little bit of quinacridone gold as well. And then we'll just be using a couple of darker colours. So I happen to use a sepia, a indigo and a moon glow, and a perylene violet today. I will talk you through these colours as I use them for my final project. And they're just ideas. So again, don't need these specific colours, but use your own, do some mixing, experiment and have a bit of fun. And lastly, there's just the bits that we always forget but are obviously quite important. I've got a really big jug of water. I use a sort of 1 litre pot so that I've got loads of water to play with. I use a towel or some kitchen roll just to mop up the water from my brush, keep it nice and clean. I also pop things on a drawing board when I paint so that I can masking tape down the edges and keep it nice and flat. And in case you're interested, I'll do some of the demos just in a normal A5 sketchbook today. And that is literally everything that I'm using today. So with that, let's get into the lessons in proper. Now this first lesson is very short and it's a sort of revision of theory type lesson. So we're going to have a look at basic principles of perspective to make sure that we've got a grounding going forward. We're going to make things more complicated and more fun by thinking about that vertical perspective. Okay, so in this first lesson we're going to cover 3 key points really quickly. And they are the key points of perspective: horizon line, vanishing points, and lines of perspective or structural lines. Now, the horizon line is a line which is level with our eyes. So everything level with our eyes, everything at eye level in a scene will be on this horizon line. The vanishing points for horizontal perspective will then also sit on this line. Now they might sit on this line on your page, or they could be a long way off your page. It could be miles off your page. It depends on exactly how steep the perspective is. From these, if we say that our vanishing points are on the page, just for demonstration purposes, you can build up a box, for example, or a 3D object. So if we draw in a vertical line in the middle of the box, we could then build in our structural lines or our lines of perspective, and they are straight lines which come from the vanishing point and go outwards. And then the vertical lines in the scene, so this is 2-point perspective, the vertical lines in the scene are all vertical. So what we could now do is, instead of having this as a box, it could suddenly become a block of flats or a house or something like that. And what's going to happen is, as we go up and up, the windows and things like that will angle. So these tops of the windows are all sitting on lines of perspective. So there'll be another line coming down like this. All of these lines of perspective are coming down to the vanishing point. And like that, you can build up using a horizon line, using structural lines, all vanishing at your vanishing points. You can build up your scene. And that is the basics of perspective. In vertical perspective, things start to change. So we still have these vanishing points, but now our vertical lines are no longer vertical. So in the next lessons, we're going to look at why that is. We're going to look at how to work with that. And then, of course, we're going to do an example or two. So with that basic grounding out of the way, we can now move on and start thinking about 3-point perspective. And with 3-point perspective, we're going to take our 2 vanishing points on our horizon line, and we're going to add a 3rd vanishing point, which is somewhere up there, somewhere off our page, usually, and above us. And to have a look at this, we're going to do it practically. So there's a reference photo that is in the class resources. And we're going to have a look at that reference photo, and I'm going to sort of annotate and scribble on it, and we're going to see exactly where we find our 3rd point of perspective. So let's have a look at this photo and work out where we can find our 3rd point of perspective. Now, to show you it's got 2 points of perspective, let's just first start by mapping that out really quickly. So we can find our horizon line by tracing all these people's heads through the scene. And we know if we can draw a line, and hopefully you can see that that quite comfortably covers everybody's heads. So that's our sort of flat horizon line. And then we've got all these lines in the scene. So we can trace these, and just by finding a few of them, we'll be able to find our vanishing point. And our vanishing point, as we discussed, may not be on the page. So on this side, it's probably just here, isn't it? Just off the page. On this side, it's going to be
probably a long way off the page, but we can still see these lines are sloping down, and probably, what, 50-60 centimetres over that way will be our vanishing point. So we've also got other sloping lines, have we? We haven't actually got many vertical lines in this scene, which are actually going vertically, going straight up. So if we actually start just tracing out some of these lines, then we can see that one's sort of going slightly to the left, this one slightly left, so this one's going a long way off to the left, really angling. So if I just taken the photo wonky, well, maybe I've taken this photo a little bit wonky, but then if we look up at this side here, it slopes off to the right. So what becomes evident is that actually we're going to have all these lines meeting somewhere way up there, way up off the top of the screen. And that's because we have another point of perspective. We have a vertical point of perspective way up here. And I've got another example to show you so that we can see that this isn't just in this photo, and actually you'll recognise it in all sorts of photos. So in this scene we've got a tall building, and again we trace all those vertical lines, we find they all slope up, and then we can take a step back and we can find, if we just simplify those lines a little bit, we can find, yeah, sure enough, what we've got is a vertical point perspective, which is some way up the page.
So now I want to have a little chat to you about how our position affects vertical perspective, and just how that might relate to how we choose to compose our image. So we're going up for a close-up view of something or a distant view. How does that feel, and why does it look different and feel different?
So I really quickly again want to just explain and show you why sometimes vertical perspective is so obvious and sometimes it's really not. And a nice example would be to take, let's say, a horizon scene from a city. So if we just doodle ourselves a little horizon, and let's say we're looking at this from miles away, the sort of classic prints and sketches that you get, and what you'd find is basically all of the walls, all the skyscrapers are looking basically vertical. So there's not really any perspective at all, certainly not going up. But suddenly you get really close to one of those buildings and it looks more like this, and you could probably not even fit the whole thing into your field of vision, and all the windows going up are really steeply angled as well. So up here you've got really thin windows, down here thick but with really steeply angled sort of vertical lines. And why is that? So why is this happening? Well, it's all to do with the angle of vision. Different angle, so confusing, but bear with me, and I should hopefully make this clear. So let's say we've got this scene, and if I just draw one of these skyscrapers here, and we're looking at this. When we're looking at this scene, we're standing here, absolutely miles away. So the angle of vision, so the angle from our eyes to the top, is quite low. So this is the angle that we're worrying about. So it's, what, 10 degrees? It might even be like 1 degree if you're looking at something 100 meters high from 5 kilometers away, for example. But when we're close like this, so if we're all the way up here, our eyes are still at the same height, but suddenly this angle of vision is enormous. So this is almost 90 degrees. And the closer you get, so the more this angle of vision changes, the steeper the perspective will be. The further away you get, the flatter that perspective becomes. And that helps us think about how we are framing a scene. So, for example, if we're doing a lighthouse, if we want to draw it as a flat, distant object, we think about how we frame it within our scene, and we frame it as a small object. if we want it to have loads of perspective, it's going to feel claustrophobic, because to be really angled, to have massive perspective, you have to be really close to it, you have to fill your vision. So suddenly we've got this lighthouse, which maybe is, again, barely fitting into our page. We certainly can't see the top and the bottom, and we just see, there's a small window here, and put in this, it becomes this huge part of our vision. So using perspective is changing the feel of the scene, especially with something like vertical perspective, where it implies being close or being far away from it. So hopefully now we've covered the basic sort of theory, ideas, understanding, which means we can jump straight in to doing a couple of example sketches and then our final project. So we've talked a lot now about perspective, how to do it, why this, why, lots of theory and a little bit of practice as well. But this lesson, I want to just turn it on its head and go, well, now that we know perspective, now that we understand vertical perspective, 3-point perspective, what happens if, because we know it, we change it, make it wrong? And actually, just show you really quickly with a little sketch, and again, the reference photo in class resources, which you can have a play with. But what happens if we invert it? And we can do this because we understand it. And we can make it have more character, have more fun. So let's have a little play. So before we get started with our final project, which will be about 3-point perspective, about creating a lovely sketch from 3-point perspective, I want to invite you to, as with all other forms of perspective and everything in art, and certainly my style of art, to think of vertical perspective as your friend and your tool to do what you would like with it, to enhance your art. It's not a rule, but as soon as you're aware of it, you can use it, manipulate it. So I'm going to do a little sketch with you now. So the reference photo is up here and it's in the class resources file. And this is not the reference I'm using for my final project, but I would welcome you to sort of join in and play with this photo with me as well. So I'm just in a normal little sketchbook here, not waterproof paper, just going to do a lovely ink sketch here. And we're going to play with the perspective and we're going to see what we can do with it and manipulate it to make it wrong, but make it interesting, and see what that does and see how much character that adds. So let's just start by bringing in this scene. So we've got, if I come across on one page, we've got our little tree here. And then we've got these sort of row of houses and things. And this is going to lead us up very nicely to our church. And you can see, really, really loose, really quick sketch. And the edge of our church is sort of here. And what we can see, if we just have a look at it while we sketch, we've kind of got a definite bit of horizontal perspective. I mean, this street disappearing off here. And then with the church, you can see it's got its own vanishing point off over there somewhere. So we've got definite horizontal perspective, and we can probably just make all these vertical lines flat. So what we've done, we turned this background into a really quick, sort of fun, loose, 1-point perspective background to our focal point. So hopefully you can see that everything's sort of sweeping off, going that way. Now if we look at the church, we can see the church has definitely got some vertical perspective. So if we draw this line in, it's quite straight, but as we get over and over, it gets narrow, and it means at the top it's narrower than at the bottom. But what if we don't want that to be the case? What if we want to make a feature even more so of this church? And there are lots of lovely ways of doing this, but I'm going to say, why don't we reverse perspective? So rather than ignoring it, rather than making it a 2-point perspective or a 1-point perspective scene where all our verticals come straight, why don't we do something different? So this line can stay straight because we've already drawn it in, and then these ones can come out. So suddenly, instead of what should happen, so this should be getting narrower and narrower, but it's not. The top, what's happening is we're getting wider and wider. And we can make a sort of real exaggeration of that. You know, as you would see in reality at the top it's more exaggerated, but we're exaggerating it the wrong way. So we've got suddenly this building just getting wider and wider instead of narrower and narrower. Hopefully you can see if I draw little structural lines, sort of doing something like this, and we've almost got a vanishing point down here instead of up there. It's not quite down here because the lines are bending, because we're sort of keeping the church somewhere in reality down here, but we could even do it with the doorway. So we can bring that doorway and make it widen. Just get a couple of these pillars in and they can have that same flow. So we just get that flow going outwards. And finding those key little features. And in some ways we're going to have to invent things because we're drawing in a way that doesn't exist. But it doesn't totally not exist. All we're doing is taking perspective and stretching and bending it, which is fine. And why is that fine? Because it's what we always do. Even if we do 3 or 4 or however many points of perspective we find, we're still simplifying reality. Reality is we walk around with a constantly shifting perspective as we move, and we've got fisheye vision because we've got spherical eyeballs. So everything we do to sketch is a simplification anyway. So warping it one way or another, you know, it's all fine. We're still doing the same thing, just with a different decision-making process. And what's the feel? Just as we sketch this, or certainly as I sketch it, and please do join in and have fun with this idea as well, if you like. What do you think the feel of this church is now that it's coming up to this, that it's sort of, instead of being a flat object, instead of being a sort of real hard and fast sketch, then we've got this out feeling. Well, for me, it's adding character, it's drawing the eye, it's perhaps a little cartoony or illustrative, but it doesn't have to be. That's partly because I'm drawing it so loose. And what we've done is we've taken our awareness of perspective, our understanding of perspective, and that has enabled us to manipulate it to create something really interesting, really fun. We could do the same and warp some of these sort of lamps as well. We've already got a lamp coming in the side which is bent and warped anyway. And then we do the same in the background with these little ones. And so now we've got this feel. So the long and the short of this little example sketch, and I hope you have fun joining in with it as well. And you share your warping and you're having fun with things. The long and the short is, it doesn't matter if you get perspective wrong, but understanding it and being able to do it does mean you can play, make those decisions, know what you're doing, and create really interesting feels. So this is my little example of warp sketching. I look forward to seeing yours in the class projects if you want to do them. But without further ado, let's move on and we can start our final project together. So the final project will of course be a 3-point perspective sketch, and what I'd love you to do, if you're feeling up to it, is to join in and share yours in the class gallery at the end. To do that, you'll find the reference photo that I'm using in the class resources. Though of course you're welcome to use another photo or go out a real en plein air, on location urban sketcher and sketch a scene somewhere around you. I'll show you my whole process step by step, fully in real time, and talking about every decision I'm making as I go along. I'll start with a pencil sketch, getting those lines of perspective, getting those vanishing points, and analysing how we're simplifying our scene. I'll add on some ink, little wibbly wobbly lines that outline the scene but don't say too much and don't overdo it. We'll add on loose washes of colour, keeping drama and variation, but again, not overcomplicating things and working out how we are using our colours to tell our story and to enhance that perspective before the finishing touches, some bold ink and those little final touches of brighter colour, and of course adding a little signature at the end, being proud of what we've done, loving mistakes as much as we love everything which went well. As I said, what would be amazing is when you're done, just take a quick photo, share it in the class gallery, and let me know how it went. Let me know your thoughts and what went well and what you would like to try again or what you would do differently in the future. I'll make sure to come back and give you some feedback, some encouragement, and also answer any questions you might have either there or in the class discussion. So without further ado, let's get into the lessons proper and see how we're going to start thinking about our perspective. So now it is, in fact, time for our final project. Now this first section of the final project, I'm going to be doing a pencil sketch. Now the reference photo, as ever, in the class resources. So open that up and have a look at it. And I'm going to be firstly focusing with my pencil on where are the vanishing points, or at least where are the key lines that we're constructing. So if we just take a little moment before I get my stuff out, I can show you a sort of digitally annotated version of the reference photo here. And what you can see when we're looking for the vertical perspective is there's loads going on. And if we just simplify that a little bit, we can get a feel for where our vertical vanishing point is. And it's probably a page height away from the top of the tower. So keep that in mind as we go through this sketch. That's the kind of easy way of thinking about how high, how angled our wall's going to be. And let's just see how we do with our sketching. So the first step is going to be a pencil sketch. So I'm using a rotring 0.7mm mechanical pencil. I love mechanical pencil because it's always sharp. So, you know, as long as it's lead in there, we can always make it nice and sharp. And you don't have to use a pencil, you don't have to start with this step. I normally just go straight with the ink. But I think for learning perspective, for analysing perspective, actually it's really useful to start by using a pencil sketch. So with our pencil, let's start mapping in some structural lines and seeing what we're going to do with our sketch to make it interesting. Now the first thing I'm going to do is turn this into a portrait, because with a portrait sketch we'll be able to make more of the vertical perspective. And you can see the reference photo, we have our tower sort of in the middle of it. Well, something in the middle is a focal point, creates a lot of tension, and for me, not that enjoyable. So I'm going to shift it over. So if we just squidge our reference photo a little bit, this is the kind of composition I'm going to go for. And then from having worked that out, we can start by sketching in our key lines. So we've got a kind of horizon line which is down here. Now you might notice that lots of the people don't fit on that horizon line. The reason for that is two things. One, the very slight slope, but also a lot of those people in our reference are children, and the children are shorter than me. So their heads are below the horizon line, and it means that they will be sort of not fitting our horizon line rule. Their heads will be lower than it. But if you look at the back near the house, you'll see most people's heads and all the adults' heads in the foreground as well do fit on a nice line. So there's our horizon line. We've then got slightly complicated horizontal perspective. So we've actually got a vanishing point, which is this building on the left. And that's going in like this. Something like that anyway. We've then got our tower, which is about here, and we can get in that line there. And there's another one about there. And the vanishing point, as we looked at before, is somewhere up the top. And then we've got another building. Now this building is on a different angle. So we've got building on the left is on this angle, facing down there. Building on the right is going this way. So it's got a vanishing point somewhere over here. So we can find approximately that. And we can sketch that in as well. And then the building back here is again back on approximately, and it's not exactly, but we always simplify things. So it's approximately on the same vanishing point. So we can use these same vanishing point, all these same structural lines to build it in. Now, just a word of note, why is it not on exactly the same vanishing point? Well, it's not on the same plane. So this building is facing like this here, this one here is on about this angle, so sloping slightly. The one over here is more like this. So its vanishing point is on a different plane, so it exists in a more complex world than our simple 3-point perspective. It's got its own vanishing point somewhere closer. We're going to ignore that. We're going to simplify things as we always do, manipulate them, make it our sketch, our world, and we're going to use about the same structural lines. And then we've got another one back in the distance here. And for the same reason, because it's on a different plane, its vanishing point is slightly different. But we can ignore that. So we've got basically our structural lines there, and we should also have a vertical one here, give or take vertical. And from there, we can start doing a quick pencil sketch of the scene itself. So I'm going to come in and start just getting the heights of things a bit right. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just approximately right. And we can find, again, from all these lovely points that we've mapped in already, we can quite quickly just put in the important ones, the important lines that is, and we can just find that our kind of perspective-laden scene, as complex as it is, just quite quickly and relatively accurately emerges without much fuss. Because all we're doing is we're creating boxes. Then we've got this one which comes across. Just to look how far the roof line comes across. It comes across this line here, comes across this vertical line. And so it goes up to the middle, which this one then comes across, comes down. And then we've got this kind of canopy, which is also on its own lines of perspective. But remember, keep things simple. There's no need to draw everything perfectly. That's a photo. What we're doing is we're creating our world, our bit of art. At the top, we've obviously got this little sort of dome. So pop that in. And it's possible, I've not even done enough perspective in these lines, but we can change that when we come in later with our pen. Now we've also got all these windows and things. They can be on their own lines of perspective as well. So if we map those in, that makes it very easy to just add them. All of these little horizontal lines we can just scratch in. And remember, they're also going to be heading down to a vanishing point. And again, approximately the same vanishing point as these other horizontal lines we've got. There's somewhere over here all these horizontal lines will meet. Just find these little details that we want to not forget. Window, little clock faces, another window. Remember the sides of these windows are on those vertical lines of perspective as well. Loads of windows going here. We don't have to draw them all in, just enough to remind ourselves. And what I have forgotten to do is the sort of bottom here of our building and the bottom of the clock tower. And that probably needs to come down. And this is where you can find the mistakes you've made. So perhaps you can spot the mistake I've made, which is this canopy is too low. So the canopy for some reason is at the bottom of the church, which isn't right. So that's great, we're moving up. So we just redo our canopy. And this is where, it is nice to have done a pencil drawing. So now our canopy makes sense in the sort of rest of the scene. Little line for our tree here. And that is my pencil sketch done. And hopefully you can see the scene already just starting to emerge with just a few little structural lines, followed by reinforcing those ones which seem right and building our scene around it. Next we're going to be adding in some pen. Now we've got those key lines in, we've got the structure in place with our pencil. Now I'm not pretending everything is perfect or correct, but with our first pen lines, which we're doing now, we have the opportunity to move things around and change things if we want. Everything doesn't have to be correct either, certainly doesn't have to be accurate. But let's just see, as we make these first sort of bolder pen lines, how we decide to change things, how we decide to keep things the same, as we move through to creating, more of a finished final image. So, time to add in our pen, as I said. Now I'm going to start off with just a fine liner. This happens to be a 0.05mm fine liner. I'm going to be contrasting that later with a much bolder 0.5mm fine liner. But using a little gentle fine liner first, let's just change things, move things, get things wrong. I'm going to start with our focal point, and remember I felt perhaps I hadn't angled this perspective enough, so I start on the outside of this line and I end on the inside of it, so now I know I've increased the angle of the perspective. And I might even just, do the same here, start just on the inside and angle down and down and down. And it's fine, I'm allowed to exaggerate the perspective of a scene. It's my art, my little world. So I can do what I want. So don't be afraid to make changes which you think are creatively or visually appealing. We can add in this little line, which it's not perfectly vertical in the reference, but it may as well be vertical. And again, that just simplifies things. And then we can start building other key parts around it. We've got this roof line, which is partly hidden behind the tree. And then got the edge of the house underneath of the roof line, and then we can start in on the windows. So I'm doing a bit of by force of habit, I tend to do little continuous lines and link things up. There's no reason you have to do that. I just love the feel, I enjoy doing it, I think it looks cool, so that's why some of my lines join up. And then we can come and we can do our canopy that we were happy we had only pencil sketched in because we got it wrong. And then we can come onto this building and start adding that in. If we look, it feels right already. It feels right. This building feels good, so we can stick with it. And remember, these vertical lines are also sloping, and I didn't actually, as I was sketching them earlier, I wasn't thinking that hard about it. So again, angle that line a little bit more, and that exaggerates our perspective a bit more and shows that we're dealing with a real 3-point tool and sort of characterful 3-point perspective scene. As we go off to the side here, just losing a bit of detail because we don't want to overdo it, and we can just start adding in a couple of suggestive lines of what might be going on off the edge of the scene. Then let's just start finding little details. So we can find these little windows, and there's like a blackboard here. I think this is a sort of blacked out window down here. And then some more windows. And remember these vertical lines, again, they're fitting our lines, all these vertical lines fitting our different lines of perspective, getting more and more angled as we get over. Now it doesn't matter if they're not perfect, but just remember the feel. Remember the feel, because that keeps the character of the scene feeling right, basically. And you can see I've simplified it, so I've cut out these windows at the top and made the roof simpler. That's, again, our prerogative as artists. We do what we want. Here's a little chimney, which again, all pointing, but all fitting that feel of the perspective. Having done a bit of background, let's make a bit more of our lovely clock tower. We can find all these other extra lines. We can find these little details. The clock faces, which kind of sit in a little recessed square. Let's even do the clock hands, because why not? And then we can suggest some numbers around the outside. And we can get that window in as well. With the window, you can kind of just see a really big frame, can't you? So don't forget to make things 3D. We've got a big frame here, a tiny bit of window. And on the other side, it's kind of the reverse. So a little frame and a bit more window. We can draw some little frame lines in as well. Got the same clock face, so let's try and remember to make it about the same time. Because that would be a bit of a sort of continuity error, wouldn't it? And we can add in all these little lines, and they kind of actually got what, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, there's one more that we can add in, and it doesn't matter if you counted them right or wrong, or mine are obviously in slightly the wrong place, but that's fine. I imagine very few people, even people who live next to this lovely church, know just offhand how many of those lines there are. So it also means we're perfectly fine getting it a little bit wrong, not quite getting it correct perfectly. I'm going to move up to the top here, and this is a very complicated shape. So take it easy, make it gentle, see how it looks, then come back to it. So we can just get in an idea of it now. We can come back later and see if we like our idea, if we think it needs to move. And that again is the advantage of a really thin pen. In the background we've got more of these chimneys. Again, having them slope, so everything's moving in the same direction. And we're kind of almost there with our key lines, is what I would say at least. So we can start adding in a few more of these little details. And perhaps start making little touches, those things like little brick marks, little bits of sort of grubbiness on the wall with just a few textural lines. Finding things we hadn't first paid attention to, so there appears to be like a tiny sort of roof edge here. Little chimney here, and then we can even get like textural lines on our rooftops. There's another example. A few sort of marks to suggest to the viewer that there's tiles on the roof rather than something else. Here we can come back and just see, do we want to change anything, modify anything? And then we've got our foreground feature. We've got our tree. So what I'm going to do is basically make the tree a bit of an outline. The nice thing about trees and natural objects when it comes to perspective and architectural scenes like this is that they do have perspective, but they're so natural in their shape, flowing, that actually they often feel like they're breaking that perspective. They're unpredictable. And so having something like this in your scene is a nice sort of counterfoil to all those straight lines. It stops everything feeling like it's just sort of having to flow up. Suddenly we've got this object which isn't. It's got this kind of different feel. And what I've done, I've just done a really gentle outline, lots of sort of random leaf-like shapes. And we can do a few more in the middle of the tree. But it's quite transparent, isn't it? And it's got a few golden leaves, more so on this side. But you can see through it a lot, and it's more about the kind of branches and things. Rather than drawing all the branches as a line and wash sketcher, what can be nice is to draw the outline and have it as just a slightly more abstract thing in our sketch. Now, what else is there to add in? We've got all these people, haven't we? So we have our horizon line, which is great. So we can start just loosely adding in the people where we want them. And we can find people in the scene and add people from the scene into our sketch. We could add these younger people. Just remember to make them appear young, change that the proportions. So a younger person, as well as being below the horizon line, will have a bigger head to body ratio. So just by doing that, it makes them appear younger. Then we can come back and we can start adding in more people. We can add an adult to the foreground just to show that these really are people. When I say adult, look at these shapes I'm making. They're very, very, very loose. They're certainly very loose, but that's fine. that's not what the scene is about. The scene is showing it's busy with these people, it's great, but it's about the perspective. It's about, more than just trying to draw people really perfectly. Okay, I think we're pretty much there as well now with our ink. So I'm going to stop that before I've done too much. Remember, we can come back, and we will come back, and we'll add some more touches at the end. But now what we're going to do, just stop and add a little bit of watercolour, splash on some loose colours to bring the scene to life before reinvigorating with some bolder lines, that perspective, and getting control of the scene again. So with all that lovely ink work done, it's time to add our colour. So this first layer of colour, which is going to be the main colour we add in this lesson, is going to be loose. But we're going to be thinking still about perspective. So how can we apply our colour in a manner that highlights the key feature of this image, which is that vertical perspective? So now it is time for some colour. And colour may not feel like a necessary part of perspective, but actually it really is a part of our perspective. And I'll try and talk you through as we go why I think that is. And it involves, for example, using colours to reinforce the feel of lines, but also making sure that things which are distant in perspective are paler or less intense, less saturated. Things which are more important or closer are more intense, more saturated. Now the first thing I'm going to do is the sky, and I'm going to apply lots of water, and I'm going to apply water to either side of my little tower, and I'm going to leave the top for now. I'm going to leave the top and see what it looks like, because by applying that water either side we're going to be accentuating this upward feeling, and we're not going to be closing the top of the tower. So I'm hoping that what we get is this feeling of the tower sort of breaking through the sky. So that's the first way that we're thinking with our colours about perspective. And having put the colour in, I don't have to paint it. What do I mean? I just pop the colour down and look, it paints itself. So this is sort of cobalt blue. And watercolours are more than happy to paint themselves if you let them, if you give them the right environment. You can see with all that water the fascinating shapes it makes. And we can come in, we can squidge around with our brush, we can make more shapes. And look at the reference photo for a moment. So see how dramatic some of those colours are. See how dramatic and the gaps in the sky are. And also have a look at how the sky sort of also feels. It does have perspective as well. Everything has perspective. You can sort of get a feel for that just by having a quick glance at it. You can see how it's got this kind of feel perspective. So we're trying to emulate that kind of activity, interest in the sky. Next I'm going to just get a little bit more drama with a couple of dark colours. So first some indigo. And indigo is lovely sort of, well, I'm sure you know indigo is a nice lovely dark blue. Almost a bit Payne's grey in colour. And we can just touch that in a few places. Do you see how it's settling, how all the paint is sort of settling into the image already? So we can already see that actually we could take a bit more blue or something like that. Now I also keep my towel nearby so I can dry off my brush. Then I can use that to lift up a bit of water and manipulate this sky a little bit more. And again, that's just trying to get that drama, that dramatic feeling going. Having done that, yeah, let's paint, well, let the blue paint itself again. Or let's paint a bit more blue, touch a bit more blue into that sky. There are lots of choices like this that we can make as we keep moving. We could keep working on this sky for ages if we wanted and keep making it more and more dramatic. Of course, we're going to have to stop at some point, so just a few more touches here. And then I said a couple of darker colours. So I'm also going to add a bit of moon glow, which I think is a really wonderful dramatic colour. And then I'm going to soften some of the edges where we've got these really hard, obvious edges everywhere. the edge of our sky. I'm just going to soften them and see what happens. And a few little, I think a few touches of colour in above the tower. But I wanted to have that breaking through feeling. Now, next we've got these lovely roofs. What I want to do is just get rid of a little bit of that water at the bottom of the sky. Now, I like colours bleeding together. So if you don't like that, then I would let things dry a bit before moving on to the roof. If you don't know if you like that or if you do like it, I'd encourage you to experiment and just try doing a little bit of painting where everything's going to be running together and bleeding. So I'm taking a bit of red. This happens to be Mayan orange. I'm going to touch it into the sky, into the roofs, and it will go into the sky. So just by touching it in, letting it touch the blue, we'll get this lovely mix of red and blue, which of course forms sort of neutral purple type colour. The closer we get to orange, the closer it will get to neutral, because orange and blue are colours which neutralise each other. They are sort of complementary colours. And you can see this sort of subtle, soft blending and bleeding of colours. I'm going to continue our wash down the page. So look at this really bright house. So I'm going to use a Hansa yellow, a really bright yellow, to get that. And as we get into the distance, so as I said, with atmospheric perspective, the further back you go, the more washed out colours are, less saturated. So there's some colour in these distant houses, but I'm making sure it's less saturated, so it's not as in your face, and that helps make it feel distant, along with the linear perspective, that's the distance. This building over here is a much more mellow colour, so I'm using a little bit of quinacridone gold mixed with a little bit of indigo from my palette. And again, you may not like these effects, but I love them, so I'm going to have these colours just come down the page. A little splash here of our lovely yellow, and just a pooling down in the corner. With the other side, if I get a little bit more quinacridone gold, oh, that's a bit of the wrong colour, try again, quinacridone gold, I can get that pooling down. And much like with the sky, whilst this is still wet, we can still fiddle and play and let it paint itself, as they say. And just move things around. I'm going to come in to do our see-through tree now. And remember how we sketched it as an outline here? Well, I'm going to kind of come in just with sepia initially, kind of mellow, lovely mellow brown. And I'm going to get that outline. I'm going to leave this middle blank and just see how it feels. And then come down the tree trunk. And again, just try and get these lovely soft colour to mingle where the tree is see-through, this feeling of mingling with background colours. It's also, we talked about lovely gold, so let's get a bit more of that quinacridone gold and see what it looks like mingling in. Just taking it step by step, keeping things wet. We've got it all to sort of just all to play for. We can edit it, we can have fun. We can keep these sort of sweeping feelings going with that colour. We're just building it up, seeing how much we want to do really. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. We can come back and we can do more with the pen, more with the colour, whatever, in a bit. Now the lovely tower is obviously our main point. It's also not got a huge amount of obvious colour. So what it does have is shadows. So I'm going to start by using just a little bit of indigo from the corner of my palette here. And I'm going to add a bit of shadow to this side. I'm going to exaggerate the difference in shadow between the two sides. And actually, to make it a little bit more interesting, I'm going to add a little bit of pearly violet to that kind of murky purple. And then we can sort of bring that in under all these horizontals, and again, just see how it feels. But I also want plenty of white coming through. Plenty of white coming through underneath. You can find then that actually it's more convenient to have this tree gold over this white, because it explains a bit more. And I think we're almost there. So last little bit, just this foreground feels quite empty, doesn't it? So just a gentle bit of tone pops in, a little bit of indigo. And again, we can bring it to these lines of perspective. And we can make it follow lines of perspective. And by doing so, it enhances that linear feel going around. So I'm going to let this dry now, and then we're going to have a look at it and see. And I think a few finishing touches, and suddenly this will come together. And with that colour done, it's time to do the finishing touches. So the finishing touches there include both some penwork and the sort of second little touches, the second layer of colour. So in the next few minutes, what we're going to do, add a much bolder line. Again, we're trying to think, where do we reinforce perspective? Where do we break perspective? And where do we add a little bit of extra detail? And then with the colour, how do we just, having seen those bold lines, how do we make things feel colourful, bright and alive? So we are back, and we are pretty much totally dry. So what are we going to do? We're going to finish this off with a few little touches. I'm going to start with my pen. The reason I start with my pen is because it will bring everything together. Where these colours got mad or loose or not quite within the lines, we can reevaluate our lines. We can also refocus the lines which are important for our perspective. And then we can add highlights and deeper shadows and things with our watercolours if we want. So let's start up here with our focal point. And that will let us know how bold our lines are looking. And that will let us in turn work out how bold our less important lines need to be. Now this is a very bold pen. This is a 0.5mm pen, much bolder than I often use, but I thought, it's fun to experiment and change up often what you're using. And also when we're doing such a drawing as this, something where lines are really important, then having a bold line to emphasise it might be more interesting. What I'm doing, I'm just going to find those key lines. Not every line, but those key lines, including things like these chimneys we found in the background. And there's ones which define the perspective, those certainly the keyest of key lines. It doesn't matter if I go a bit wrong. This one's a bit wrong, isn't it? Doesn't matter. We can just play it loose fast and loose and have a bit of fun anyway. This doesn't matter if you have a few mistakes here and there. That's the humanity of the art. And as we get further out, again, just making those lines a little bit loose, a little bit scratchier. We come down here and got more sort of complex shapes going on, but we can find them and just sort of loosely add them in. With a nice bold pen, we could very easily create these very dark areas, create sort of very bold contrast. And let's find again those hands and things like that. And perhaps some of the finer areas, like these little frames inside the windows, want to leave and maybe come back to with our fine pen if it feels necessary in a moment. Now might be the time where we start just defining this bulb a little better. Now that we can see it in comparison to everything else, we can add a few little extra pen details, for example. Maybe just this hard to see bit, it's hard to see in the reference, so let's block it in, give it a real deep contrasting shadow. And then let's come and just look at this lovely tree and find some of these shapes. So now we can get this like overlapping thin pen, thick pen, find the colours and the edges that the colours have got to, and use that to define the sort of translucent or see-through, transparent even, tree. We can extend it past where the colours are gone as well. Don't have to be limited to what's happened already. We can sort of redefine things. Get a nice bold trunk coming down. Bit of texture on the trunk if we want. It is, after all, in the foreground. It's an important part of the foreground as well. And just sort of making these kind of semi-random leaf-like shapes and bringing them in towards the tree as well, towards the tree trunk, in this kind of scattered pattern, imitating the kind of branches that we've got in the reference without copying them. So influenced by rather than necessarily directly trying to copy or get the exact tree across. In the background, remember some of these windows, we can do a little bit of hatching to get the idea of the depth of colour in them. Same here. You see how now this translucent tree is really sort of working, it's kind of there but not there. And the house behind it is, again, there, but the building's there but not quite there. But that's the same effect we get in the actual reference. Not going to try and overdo the drawing either. So we've got these kind of very bare bones bits for example, this canopy. And I'm not going to try and overdo it. I'm just going to, take the lines we have got and make them into something which represents the idea. And there's a lot of shadow and confusion underneath, but we don't even have to do this shadow. We can just leave that. So let's leave it as essentially negative space and just see how it feels at the end. I think that's going to be fine. And it's a complex but uninteresting, for me at least, uninteresting part of the reference photo. And again, these are just the decisions that we make as artists, as sketchers, drawers, painters, whatever. We're making our own decisions about what we want to include, and then see how it impacts our world, our vision. And again, just using these basic shapes I've already got, we can add little details like a couple of hands and things like that. But essentially just very loose sketched people, suggestions of people. My advice is don't spend too long in one place. Moving around the image. I did this house second, I think, originally, and only just coming back to finishing off the windows. But by jumping around, moving from place to place, we ensure we never really overdo it too much. What I'd love to do is add a few more little touches with this fine pen now. So just like in some of these roofs, getting a bit more. We did a few bits of roof texture, but they've disappeared a bit now. So just coming in and doing some real scratchy lines of texture. Could do the same in the foreground here. Said it felt a bit empty, and then we added this colour, and that I think turned out to be a really great idea. So we can do the same. We can invent bricks and things. We can just find ways to increase the sort of density of line work, which increases the complexity of the image and make it more interesting without having to exactly copy details. So just where does it feel a bit empty? Where does it feel like we could just make it a bit more interesting, and then add that texture or just add what you feel at that point is needed. And then we can come, and I said we might perhaps do a little bit more of these frame details with our thin pen. That's our time to do it now. And there we go. So I think that's our pen work done. And then it's just those last little touches of colour. So what we do, I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush here. This is a size 12 round brush, but much smaller. It feels more like a size 8, really. And I'm going to take some of our bright colours. So got our Hansa yellow here, Hansa yellow medium. Just by touching it in a few places, we create a bit of variation in our wash. And this is where we can, again, just get these drips and give them, again, another sort of punch of colour. We can come into where we had quinacridone, and we can do the same. Perhaps this time just bringing in the edge of the tree, but also maybe splashing in so that it's got this sort of natural feel and it feels like it's spreading into the environment. You could take a bit of indigo, do the same to give it a sort of two-tone variation. Maybe up in our tower, just, this purple's actually working quite nice for me, the Perylin Violet. So just a few little touches, not too much, a few touches, especially as we get lower and feels like it's more enclosed and in shadow. So we can sort of enhance that feel with a few just touches more of the paint. And I think not much more to do really. Last thing I'm going to do, just to increase the interest in our sky, just a few splashes, and then we do some more sort of concentrated splashes as well. And maybe the same, just a little something in the foreground. But not too much, just a little touch here and there. We can ground some of these people with little suggestions of shadows. And there you go. So I'm going to call that my rather loose in terms of colour, but quite tight in terms of perspective sketch. It's a line and wash sketch, sort of urban sketch style sketch. Using 3-point perspective, using loose colours to enhance that, but mostly using our pen work to really get that upward feel and that push of those linear perspectives. I hope you've enjoyed that. Let's move on to the final lesson. We're going to do a little unveiling and we will talk about next steps. So thank you everyone for joining in and getting all the way through these lessons. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope it's given you something to think about and a new tool, a new little weapon in your sketching arsenal. This is my finished sketch, and as you can see I can unveil it, take all the masking tape off, and we are left with this, which I think has worked really well. Good bit of fun. That vertical perspective pointing high up into the sky, what it really does is it just accentuates and exaggerates and just really shows off the height of the buildings, and it makes the scene feel more real and more 3D. Now have a play, because one of the lessons we looked at taking vertical perspective and warping it. You can also do other things, like instead of doing 3-point perspective, you can do 1-point perspective, where the only point of perspective is up in the sky. So there's lots of ways, now that you have all these tools at your disposal, there's lots of ways that you can manipulate them and have fun and enjoy yourself. Now, I'd love you to share your final project in the project gallery. I'd also love you to share any experimenting you do in the project gallery. Do ask any questions you have in the discussions as well. More than happy, love responding to questions and things as well. And of course, having done this course, I'd love you to have a look at my profile, perhaps follow me on Skillshare and see if there are any others which you feel call out to you. You can also find me on my socials, on Instagram and YouTube at Toby Urban Sketch. And I'd love to connect with you there as well as on Skillshare. More than anything though, I hope that you just have a little bit of fun, a little bit of inspiration, and go out or stay in and do some sketching.